I've seen a lot of questions on the forums and on Reddit about whether or not the Wood Elves will get another DLC after this one. Now, I've got my own personal opinion on the matter that I'll delve into at the end of the video, but there's a lot of evidence for and against, and we'll get into that all right now. So kick back, grab a drink of milk, and let's get right into it.
Wow.
So I guess let's start this video on the happier foot, which is the reasonings for CA to do more DLC for the Wood Elves. First and foremost, I think a lot of the community was very impressed and very happy to see the Wood Elves get an upgrade. They were one of the weaker races, or at least one of the less fun races to play for a long time, so seeing them brought up to snuff on Game 2 made a lot of folks happy, and frankly brought the Wood Elves back into the forefront for a lot of people. A lot of people like playing the Wood Elves, they just weren't really an option for a long time. As a result of that, now that the Wood Elves are already fixed, another pack for the Wood Elves down the road, whether that's in Game 2 or 3, well, almost assuredly in Game 3, I guess, it's basically just a free pass for CA now, right? They've already done most of the legwork, now they really just need to focus on Lords and units. Which I guess ties in perfectly to our next point, which is units. There is still a lot of stuff CA could hypothetically put in for the Wood Elves. There's the entirety of the Forest Spirits that aren't the tree-based ones, they're pretty much all still missing. There's a few variants that are still available on the table. I've seen some people recommend the Incarnate of Beasts. I personally disagree with that, and I'll get into that one later. But there's a lot of stuff still on the table for the Wood Elves. So, again, it's just one of those things where I think even down the road, and it's not just the Wood Elves, Lord packs are probably going to be less and less tied to units anyways. But at least in the Wood Elves case, they don't even really have to worry about it. There's definitely enough meat on the bone for them to still pump out another pack. However, a lot of the time CA likes to pick things from 8th edition when possible, and going only to older lore and different sources of lore when crucial. And this is where the many problems with another Wood Elf pack begin. First things first, there aren't any other 8th edition things for CA to pluck from the Wood Elves. They are effectively done in terms of units. So while yes, they could make units based around the variants, they could make units based around the other Forest Spirits, it's entirely going to be made up stuff. There's nothing left to actually provide the Wood Elves. And again, that Incarnate Elemental of Beast that I see people frequently suggest, sure, that does come from a legitimate source. That comes from the Monstrous Arcanum. However, if you've actually read into the Incarnate Elemental of Beasts, it has precisely nothing to do with the Wood Elves. Its two biggest users are, first and foremost, the Beastmen, who are the exact opposite of the Wood Elves, and secondly, Renegade caster of Beast Wizards. So the Wood Elves don't have anything to do with the Incarnate Elemental of Beasts, which is the only real, honest unit that's left on the table for them. Continuing with the flaws brought up by 8th edition, there is only a single remaining Wood Elf character in 8th edition, and that's Erloth. And for the life of me, I just can't imagine absolutely any players would be excited about Erloth as a legendary Lord pick. Now, while hypothetically, yes, we could take Lords from, super minor characters or super old characters or what have you, the simple fact of the matter is that including so many different characters in the Twisted and the Twilight has effectively robbed the Wood Elves of anything they could hypothetically do down the road. Ariel is already in and as a legendary hero, so she has now been removed as a legendary Lord option. The Sisters of Twilight are, of course, already the DLC Lords. Draika has, of course, also been introduced as a free LC Legendary Lord. Coetl is introduced as a free LC Legendary Lord. Dieth is in as the mechanic for the Sisters of Twilight, so it no longer makes sense to include him as a character. Nyeth is included as the campaign advisor to the Sisters, so again, it's going to be kind of awkward if they put her in and she's kind of dipping her toes into two separate campaigns now. And then lastly, even characters that aren't included in this DLC are kind of pointless now. If you look at a character like Ska, for example, his whole thing was aerial focus. There is already now an aerially focused Lord in the game because they gave the Sisters of Twilight the campaign focus of aerial units. So there's not really anything left on the bone apart from some really minor, fairly obscure characters and Erloth. Now, this is not to say that there are no characters left for the Wood Elves, just not really any good ones. And I will touch upon some possible ones down at the end of the video, but again, we are really scraping the barrel now on Wood Elves. Now, because we're scraping the barrel so badly, this kind of also feeds into a secondary issue, which is, what do you do with any other Lords? We've already got most of the core coverages done now. We've got the melee-orientated Lord. We've got the ranged-orientated Lord. We've now got a magic caster Lord in there. A lot of the playstyles are already covered, and those that weren't covered by default, the Sisters of Twilight have essentially stolen for their own mechanics. And I'm not to say that CA shouldn't have done it this way or anything else like that. There's not really a lot that they could do to make the Sisters of Twilight unique. And that's an issue that's going to plague every other Wood Elf character if they try to put one in. We're just going to very quickly blitz through the options remaining on the table, as well as why they may or may not show up. So let's start with one of my favorites, but an unlikely one, which is Gruarth. Gruarth is a Beastmaster, as his name implies, or as that would imply. He is completely focused on beasts. However, Gruarth is specifically against the Beastmen, who are very unlikely to get a Wood Elves versus Beastmen pack. You'd have 2 DLCs and 2 Game 1 races. And on top of that too, Gruarth is also dead, died killing the Beastmen that killed his beasts. Extremely unlikely for that front alone. Ska the Falconer and Thalandor Doomstar are 2 more hypothetical options, but again 2 more extremely improbable ones for the exact same reason. They are both based upon aerial units, and that focus has already been taken by the Sisters of Twilight. Thalandor also has an additional problem, which is that he is extremely 100% focused on the Goblins and Vampire Council Sylvania, both of which are distinctly Game 1 issues to deal with. It doesn't make sense to introduce them into Game 2 or 3. 2 more guys with the same issue would be Lothlin the Brave and Witchwithel. They're both kind of semi-interesting, I guess, but they both are distinctly heroes. They are not legendary lords. So while CA could hypothetically introduce them as legendary heroes down the line, they would both require to be tied into a legendary lord of some kind, and that's where things start to kind of fall on their face. 2 more characters that also share a flaw with one another, god there's a lot of these that pair up, would be Aliandor Truesight and Scarlock. Again, they possess the same issue as what Thalandor sort of had earlier, which is that their complete focus and where we know for a fact that they are distinctly in Game 1. The fact that they didn't appear in Game 1 realistically means they should never appear because it goes against their character and lore. Which I suppose leads us to our final 4 options, these being Eraloth, Xiaolin, Amidri Ironbark, and Silenoth the Blade. We'll start with Eraloth. Again, I am not a fan of the character in any way, shape, or form, and I would imagine that they would add extremely little to the game, but there is some things working in his favor to hypothetically be included someday. He is an 8th edition character. They continued his character's lore right up until the end times. He didn't kind of disappear or anything like that. He does hypothetically have some campaign focus against the Demons of Chaos, but that's more what led to his character rather than an actual focus. But that's also what works against him. He doesn't really have a focus. I suppose in battle he would be the only dedicated anti-large melee combatant, but that's not really enough to carry him. He doesn't have anything from a campaign focus or from a unit focus or anything else that you would need for a Lord pack. Again, Xiaolin was an option I brought up in my previous Wood Elf Legendary Lords video. He's hypothetically a Legendary Lord. He does lead the High Realm of Alowith. But again, there's not really a lot of point to including him. He's a fairly minor character. He has a bow, which again, we've already got ranged covered now by 2 separate lords. And there's not really a lot of focus on what he would do. Sure, he's the oldest Wood Elf, but that doesn't really give him something to focus on or to perform like, unlike what we got with every other character. These last 2 I still consider extremely improbable, but if nothing else, they at least could hypothetically have an interesting campaign. We'll start off with Amidri Ironbark. He is the leader of Aranok. He was basically a Wood Elf that got tortured to death by Daemonettes, but unfortunately the curse that they put on him, or at least unfortunately for the Daemonettes, brought him back as a Treekin, and he killed them in order to get revenge. But now he continues to be a psychopath that looks for revenge against demons. That campaign kind of writes itself. You could put him against, a Demons of Chaos faction. Very easy to slot him in. But again, incredibly minor character, no specific items, no model, nothing like that. So it's really, really hard for CA to justify putting in a character like this, unfortunately. Which is a problem that also plagues our last option, Silenoth the Blade. He's actually a really cool character, hypothetically. He's considered to be magically gifted, but that magic shows up in his bow. So you could do cool things like where his damage gets, improved depending on how much winds of magic you have left. And he even has a pretty easy campaign focus. He basically went around hunting all the enemies of Athel Loren, but the one that stands out in particular is he shattered a ruby amulet from a chaos wizard, and he took all the broken pieces of that ruby amulet, put them into specific arrows, and uses those to hunt specific targets. So you could give him a kind of, hunter-esque campaign focus. But again, this is a super minor, super out-of-date character. This is back from before Warhammer was even a battle game. This is back when Warhammer was still an RPG. So again, it doesn't really make a lot of sense for CA to go this route, especially concerning he has no rules, he has no items, and he has no model. Now, I'm sure some of you are not going to be convinced by any arguments that I give, and that's totally fine. I get that all of this is subjective anyways, because no one apart from CA and Sega know what the long-term plan is with the Wood Elves. However, if you're putting a gun to my head and telling me to pick, almost assuredly I think the Twisted and the Twilight will be the last DLC we ever get for the Wood Elves. They might get a free DLC Lord or a free DLC option or stuff like that down the road, but no more actual DLC packs, and that reason is twofold. Apart from the Eraloth, who is an extremely dull character from both a gameplay and lore perspective, they don't have any legendary Lord picks that really honestly make sense. On top of that, even if they do hypothetically create a legendary Lord, they don't have enough units to back that up either. So sure, they could bypass the units, sure, they could put in a legendary Lord, sure, they could try to do a bunch of smaller things, but at a certain point that just becomes worth more effort, or it's costs more effort than what it's worth. So I think, honest to God, that the Twisted and the Twilight will be the last DLC we ever get for the Wood Elves. I know, kind of ending on a bummer note, but there you have it. Anyways, I want to thank you so much for watching. I am going to get the Dawn of War modding video up at the end of this week, so stay tuned for that. But in the interim, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you all next time.